Hello, and welcome to the Labor John podcast, where we unite the entire human race under the banner of podcasting for some reason. We tried everything else. Might as well. My name is Sam. I'm one of the co-hosts, and I'm joined by my other co-host.
I'm Gabe Christie, and I'm deeply uncomfortable with the concept of uniting people under podcasting. I don't think that's a good idea.
Well, one good thing to come out of podcasting, hopefully, is our interview today with Dr. Robin Bernstein. Dr. Robin, it's good to have you on the show, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Gabe, we have some questions.
We do. Well, first, Dr. Bernstein, if you'd like to introduce yourself and let us know why you're here.
Sure. Well, my name is Robin Bernstein, and I am a cultural historian. I focus on the history of race in the United States over the past 2 centuries. I teach at Harvard University, and I am the author of a new book called Freeman's Challenge: The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit.
Thank you. And always good, cheery topics.
I tend to write about cheery topics.
Yes. But I wanted to start by just asking how the book how it came to be, because it was it's a fascinating read, but it's also telling a very broad story through an incredibly fine and detailed lens, and I just wanted to start with kind of delving into that.
Yeah, thank you for asking me that. So the book is about how prison for profit began in the North, not the South, long before the Civil War. A lot of people think that prison for profit, things like convict leasing, that is the selling of convicts' labor, things like profit-driven incarceration, a lot of people think that began in the South after the Civil War. We tend to think of labor in prisons, forced carceral labor, as, quote, slavery by another name, unquote, which is a famous term that was made by Douglas Blackman. And that's all true, except that, in fact, prison for profit, convict leasing, forced carceral labor were all invented in the North. And they were invented in the wake of Northern slavery, not Southern slavery. So you asked how this book came about. The book came about with a surprise for me. I learned about this young man, William Freeman, who was incarcerated in the Auburn State Prison, which was the prison in New York State that invented profit-driven incarceration. He was incarcerated there in the 1840s, and he was forced to work in factories that were built into the prison. And these factories were run by private companies. So he, as a prisoner in New York State, in a state prison, was forced to manufacture animal harnesses, which were then sold by private companies throughout the Northeast. And when I read about this, I was surprised. I thought, wait a minute, I was one of the many people who associated forced prison labor with the South. And I thought, well, if this is surprising to me, it's going to be surprising to a lot of other people. This changes what we know about the history of labor. This changes what we know about the North. And this person has a really important story to tell. And that's where the book came from.
Yeah, thank you. And I was definitely in that camp of, especially from a labor perspective, you tend to really hear about prison labor in terms of like prisoners being brought up during the mine wars and stuff like that. But I hadn't realized I hadn't put 2 and 2 together with the Auburn system. Even I'm also a hand tool woodworker on one of my various other obsessions. And there's a whole selection of Auburn Tool Company tools that I had vaguely known had involved prison labor at some point. But I hadn't put 2 and 2 together until reading this book that is where exactly they came from, or at least at some point in their production line.
That's probably true.
But if you can expand a little bit on the story of William Freeman and kind of go into how he ended up in Auburn, and then how his experiences there impacted the rest of his life.
Sure. William Freeman was born in Auburn, New York, and he was African American, and he was also Native American, specifically Stockbridge Narragansett. So he grew up in Auburn, New York, and he was part of the most prominent Black family in town. So he was well known in the community. There was a tight-knit, close, vibrant Black community, and he was a really important part of that. So his life was in some ways really hard as he was growing up, but in other ways, his father died when he was young. But in other ways, he had a good life, and he had a livable life. But everything changed in 1840. In that year, he was accused of stealing a horse.
Mm.
There was no hard evidence against him, but it didn't matter. William Freeman was tried, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to 5 years hard labor in the Auburn State Prison. So this was the prison that he knew well because it was where he grew up. He grew up in this on land that his grandparents had cleared. His enslaved grandparents had been forced to clear land that was adjacent to the Auburn State Prison. So this was home turf for him, and he knew exactly what he was in for. The Auburn State Prison was a vicious prison. It was the prison that invented the idea that a prison should be an economic force. Now, to us today, that's kind of an obvious idea that a prison can affect a local economy, for example, that a prison can create jobs. To us, it's second nature to know that. But that idea was in fact invented. It was invented by a group of white businessmen who lived in Auburn and who invented this shortly before William Freeman was born. So here, William Freeman is forced into the Auburn State Prison, and he's furious. He had been free his entire life. His father had been enslaved, but had become free. His grandparents had been enslaved. They had been forced to build the town that became Auburn, but they also had become free. When they all became free, this family chose the name Freeman, which tells you everything about who they wanted to be, how they imagined themselves, how they understood themselves. The word Freeman is an autobiography in one word, and that's what was important to this family. So he's thrown into the Auburn State Prison for a crime that he swore he did not commit, and he's set to work making animal harnesses 12 hours a day. What he's doing specifically is he is filing iron 12 hours a day for no compensation at all. No wages, no special privileges, no early release, literally nothing. And William Freeman, and he's 15 years old.
Jeez.
And William Freeman was furious. He thought of himself as a free person, which is exactly what he had been until that moment.
Yeah.
And he resisted. And he resisted first with words, which was an enormously brave thing to do. And then later, after he was released from prison, he sought back pay. He sought legal means to recover what he saw as the wages that the state had stolen from him. So he used first words, then he tried to use the law, and then finally he resorted to violence. And that's the murder that is in the title of my book. So William Freeman has a really important story. He did some very brave things. He did some really terrible things. And it was all a strike against the original prison for profit, the source of this diabolical system that we are all living with today.
That's a lot for a 15-year-old to go through.
It is.
It's tough.
Yeah. And his entire story through the book just really, every twist and turn just honestly just got worse. But I wanted to touch on how the Auburn system really came to be, because that in of its own right had its development up until Freeman was incarcerated there.
That's right. So the Auburn system was one of two dominant systems of incarceration in the United States at the time. The other was the Pennsylvania system. And I realize that you are located in Pennsylvania, so that's certainly something we can talk about. So the Auburn system was totally organized around the idea that a prison could be a profit-seeking institution and that a prison could be an economic force. So the Auburn prison enclosed factories within it. Factories were built into the prison from the very beginning. And the whole idea from the beginning was that prisoners were going to be forced to work and that this work would benefit people other than the prisoners.
Mm-hmm.
So at first, the work largely benefited the prison itself. The work was mainly work that was to save the prison money, which also is a bizarre idea. You know, why shouldn't incarceration cost the state a heck of a lot of money? Why should the state have any right to mitigate that cost? But that was the idea of the Auburn State Prison, was that prisoners were to be workers. Prisoners were to be workers to benefit somebody other than themselves. And this was a pretty radical new idea. Before this, prisons had existed mainly for one of three possibilities. They existed either to punish people, or they existed to redeem people, that is, to help them become better people, or they existed for the sake of control, basically to get people off the streets. So prisons prior to this time existed for one or more of these three reasons. But the Auburn State Prison came up with this radical new idea that none of these things were primarily important. That what was primarily important was the economic force. So the Auburn system created a set of practices that were all designed to increase productivity. They were not designed to punish. One of the hallmarks of the Auburn system was that every single prisoner was put into solitary confinement every night. All of the cells were individual cells. People could not see each other or hear each other once they were in the cells. So they were all put into solitary confinement every single night. And let's be clear, that is torture.
Mm-hmm.
That is a form of torture. But the purpose, ironically, was not to punish. The purpose was to prevent worker solidarity, to prevent people from resisting this system of labor. And then during the day, they were marched out of their cells and they were forced to have total silence all the time. And this is very hard to take in, but let's really pause here. They worked together in factories. They were forced to work in these factories, but they were not permitted to speak ever.
That's crazy.
It was crazy. There was total social isolation at all times. So here's William Freeman. He's 15 years old, and he's told he's not going to utter another word until he's 20. It is so hard to take that in. And so, but what's so important about this, again, this is torture. Being told you cannot speak for 5 years, that is torture. But the purpose of this torture was capitalism. Mm-hmm. It was productivity. The fact that it was torture was, in a way, just sort of a side effect. What they really wanted, the people who created this system, what they really wanted was manufacturing of goods. They wanted people to be, the phrase was silent working machines. They wanted them to be machines and just work, and never resist. And that's why this system came about. Another term for the Auburn system, it was sometimes called the silent system. It was very famous for this silence. And the silence was all about productivity.
Yeah, and
that's a lot to take in.
It is. Yeah, it is. It's very hard to take in. It was a truly evil system.
I was also intrigued by the little bit of worker solidarity that showed up while it was being built. When they tried to bring in labor from the jails as well.
I can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
So this is one of those classic lost opportunities. This is a really sad thing. So when they started building the prison, they didn't have a full vision in mind of what this prison was going to be. So like I said, the prison was created by a set of white businessmen who had no documented interest in reform, or in prison justice, or in prisons in general. They were out to make a buck.
Mhm.
And they had, and how they made a buck, it coalesced over time. So the first thing they did was they got state money. They got $20,000 from the state to build the Auburn State Prison. And $20,000 is the equivalent of about $500,000 today. At the time, Auburn was a tiny little hamlet of about 2,000 people. So you can imagine, if you have a tiny little community of 2,000 people, and then you flush it with $500,000, with more money to come every single year in perpetuity, it's going to completely change the landscape. It's going to completely change the town. And that's what happened. So originally, these entrepreneurs, their big plan was basically, we'll suck up this money from the state. It'll be this wonderful influx of cash forever. And then we'll build these factories, and the prisoners will work in the factories, and that'll be another source of cash. So then they start building the prison. And the other concept was that here they have all this money to build the prison. Well, they're going to have to hire workers. So workers start coming in from all over the state to build this prison. And when the workers are there, of course, they need to eat food. They need to stay somewhere. So they're spending money. So this is yet another source of money. They're getting these wages from the state, and they're spending them in Auburn. They're buying things. And they are not coincidentally the same things that these people, the businessmen, actually sell. Things like liquor and cotton. These are the things that the workers are buying. But then even these workers aren't enough to build the prison. So the white businessmen, they get this idea to basically bring in prisoners from local jails. So there's only one other prison in New York State at the time, but there are local jails. So they start bringing in these prisoners from local jails. And the prisoners are working side by side with the free workers. And what happens is a moment of solidarity. The free workers are horrified by the fact that the imprisoned workers are being forced to work for no money, that the prisoners are being forced to work under very bad circumstances. They're being whipped, they're being punished. And the free workers have a lot of sympathy for the incarcerated workers. And they basically they team up. And that's when the silence is imposed. Mm-hmm. There's this new warden who is brought in. And remember, this is before the prison is even completely built. A new warden is brought in. He's a military veteran. His name is Elam Linz. And he imposes a military-like discipline on both the free workers and the incarcerated workers. And he forbids them to speak at all to each other. And that is the beginning of the silent system. The silent system was originally created, again, to foment productivity because they didn't want any kind of resistance. They wanted people to just shut up and work. And the whole point of the silent system was to prevent worker solidarity and to get more work out of the laborers.
And yeah, it was also interesting to see, just coming from a Philadelphia context, because we have our 1835 general strike, which involved most of the workers building Eastern State Penitentiary. And so it was interesting to see, and that was one of the first times where you had skilled and unskilled craftsmen going out on strike together, at least in Pennsylvania. It was interesting to see both moments of solidarity like that under very similar conditions around the same time period. But then in Pennsylvania, it resulted in a 10-hour day becoming law, whereas up in Auburn, it resulted in a truly horrific system.
It did.
But I wanted to skip ahead a little bit. And so after Freeman was released from Auburn, and after the murder, could you expand a little bit on how the both the town's reaction to the murder and then his trial and defense impacted both Auburn and then also the abolitionist movement in the North.
Yeah. So William Freeman committed a murder, and he was always very clear about why he committed that murder. He committed the murder because his labor had been stolen from him. What was especially terrifying about the murder was that he murdered people who had no direct relationship to his incarceration. And that made the act a kind of an act of terrorism. The reason that terrorism is so terrifying beyond just the fact of violence itself is that it defies narrative. In an act of terrorism, you have to ask yourself, why did that person get killed and I didn't? And there's no good answer for that question. And that's why it's so disturbing beyond just the fact that it is violent. So William Freeman committed an act of terrorism, which was really an act against the state. He murdered some people that he had very little relationship with, but really his target was the state. And he said that. He was explicit about that. But that was so terrifying that white people in Auburn did not want to hear it. They did not want to hear Freeman's challenge to the Auburn State Prison, in part because every single person in Auburn had an economic entanglement with the prison in one way or another. Auburn was functioning as a kind of company town where everybody, every single person, no matter who you were, you could be a baby, you could be an old person who did not have a job at all. It did not matter. You had some kind of economic relationship to the Auburn State Prison, large or small. And the Auburn State Prison was not only galvanizing the economy of Auburn, it also was the source of identity and pride. The Auburn system had, by this time, traveled across the entire United States and into Europe. It was literally making Auburn world famous. And here was William Freeman saying that it is wrong to force people to work for no compensation. He's challenging the absolute core of the Auburn system, which is a system of labor, and that he's naming it. He's calling it out, and nobody wanted to hear that. So they had an interest in shutting him up. But what you can't do once somebody has articulated an idea through violence and through terrorism, it's very hard to simply suppress it, to simply silence it. He was no longer silenced. He was out of the prison. So what you have to do if you want to shut somebody up when they have said something in a very powerful way, what you have to do is come up with your own narrative. You have to come up with a counter story that can overpower the story that William Freeman was telling. So the white people in Auburn, they were impelled to come up with a different explanation for why William Freeman committed murder. And what they came up with, of course, was that William Freeman committed these violent acts because of race. They came up with this horrendous, diabolical, racist idea that criminality is somehow biologically inherent to Black and brown people. And again, this is another idea that is so familiar to us. And we are so familiar with this evil, racist idea. But at the time, this was actually a relatively new idea. And so when white people came up with this idea in Auburn and they started telling this story of why William Freeman committed this murder, and they started silencing and muffling and overpowering what he was actually saying, which was that he was challenging prison for profit, they came up with this racist idea, and then it got amplified because William Freeman went to trial. And the trial attracted a lot of celebrities. A lot of celebrities got involved. And so the trial became national news. It was called the trial of the half century. And it was huge, and it was amplified nationally through the press. So these racist ideas, these relatively new racist ideas got amplified nationally. And that's one of the effects of William Freeman's challenge to the Auburn State Prison.
Well, Gabe, I know what you're talking about when you said the further you go into this story, the more like horrible the aspects get. Wow.
Yeah.
They really
No.
doubled down.
Yeah, but there is redemption. I mean, you asked me about abolition. So one of the amazing things is that soon after William Freeman's trial, so William Freeman had been telling his own story, and he was overpowered by these very famous people who were telling their own stories about why he did what he did. And he, was being completely railroaded. But then the amazing thing is what Black people did in the wake of this. So Freeman's trial unleashed these horrific new narratives about race. And then once those narratives were loose in the United States, of course, Black people had to deal with the after effects. They had to live in the wake of William Freeman's challenge and William Freeman's trial and these new racist narratives. So what did they do? Well, what they didn't do was just say no. They didn't simply negate, because that's not really a powerful way to make a counter argument. You say I'm ugly, I say no, I'm not. That's not actually a powerful argument. So instead, they did something so much more powerful, which is after William Freeman's trial, Black abolitionists made Auburn a center for abolitionism. And they started coming to Auburn to tell their own stories. And I'm talking about people like Frederick Douglass. I'm talking about people like Harriet Tubman, who settled in Auburn in the 1850s and lived in Auburn 2 miles from the Auburn State Prison until her passing in 1913.
Oh,
Harriet Tubman was going to church with members of William Freeman's family. She was a part of his community. So abolitionists came to Auburn, and Auburn became a site for abolitionist publishing. Frederick Douglass's My Bondage and My Freedom was originally published in Auburn. The very first edition was published in Auburn, as well as some other cities. So this was an incredible reclamation in the wake of William Freeman's challenge.
Oh.
And I actually hadn't thought about it until now, but in a little bit of irony, all of the transportation network going into and out of Auburn probably made it a really convenient spot to get national publishing done, because you had all of the rail and road connections already.
That's right. And the rail and road connections had everything to do with the prison. They grew in relation to the prison, because remember, the prison was a manufacturing site. And so all of these raw materials had to come into the prison, and all these finished products had to go out of the prison. So roads were developed directly in relation to the Auburn State Prison. And then later, railroads were developed directly in relation to the Auburn State Prison. The railroad was immediately across the street from the Auburn State Prison. And that was not an accident. That was because of commerce. That was because of labor. And then those same railroads, they later were a perfect venue for sending out the news of William Freeman's trial, and then again for publishing. So yeah, all of these things come together. It's quite an amazing story.
And I wanted to kind of finish off by asking how you got access to all of the documents for this, because
Gabe's jealous.
A little bit. I was really amazed at the level of like almost minute by minute detail that you were able to get into in some of the accounts.
Yeah. Well, it took me a long time. It took me 9 years to write this book. Wow. So I did a lot of research. A lot of the research was in archives in New York State. and then some other archives as well. The American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, in Massachusetts, is fantastic. But a lot of these materials are actually online, and one of the reasons I have really detailed footnotes is that I wanted people to be able to follow the breadcrumbs. I wanted, if you want to do your own research into this prison, you can do it. If you have access to the internet, you can get a lot of the materials that I used. So one of the things about prisons is that prisons are bureaucracies, and bureaucracies generate a lot of print. So, and that print, a lot of it's in the public domain, it's online. The strange thing about these prison documents that I was working with, as I delved deeper and deeper into them, one day I had this revelation that every single thing I was reading in these documents was a lie. Every single thing, literally. It was the documents, these bureaucratic documents were designed to cover up the criminality of the administrators of the prison. The purpose of these documents was to lie and to hide the truth. And so that was a really interesting moment for me. I had to start learning how to read against the grain to figure out what was really going on in these prisons and how the lies actually did reveal truths. So it was an amazing archival journey. But it was brick and mortar archives in New York State for the most part, and then a whole lot of online stuff. And then one of the most important and moving moments in my research for Freeman's Challenge was when I actually went to the Auburn prison. So the Auburn State Prison still exists. It is now called the Auburn Correctional Facility, and it is the oldest continually operating maximum security prison in the United States. And it is still defined by manufacturing. What the Auburn State Prison, what the Auburn Correctional Facility manufactures today is all New York State license plates. So if you have ever seen a New York State license plate ever once in your life, that individual license plate was made by an incarcerated person who was literally walking in William Freeman's footsteps. At one point, it's not easy to get into a prison. So in my research for this book, I visited the prison many times, and I spent a lot of time walking around the outside of the prison, walking around Auburn, doing research with archives in Auburn. But only once was I able to actually get into the prison. I was invited in through a colleague who works with Cornell University. Cornell University has an amazing education program whereby people who are incarcerated in Auburn can earn an associate's degree. They can take courses and earn an associate's degree from Cornell University. And so a friend of a friend who taught in this program invited me in, which was not an easy thing for him to do because the bureaucracy is so intense. And I got to go into the prison and meet with currently incarcerated men and talk with them. And that was a really important moment of research for Freeman's Challenge.
Yeah, it sounds it. That sounds like an amazing journey to come to the book.
Yeah.
But I don't have any other questions. If I'll open the floor to Sam if you have anything that's popped up.
I don't think anything popped up question-wise, but a crazy story, and unfortunately, it's still happening. I mean, it's, as I said before, cruel and brutal. You never trust a white entrepreneur, is that what? Especially in the 1800s.
Yeah, these white entrepreneurs did not have anybody's interests at heart except for their own.
Thank you again, Dr. Bernstein. And if there are any socials you want to plug, and of course, plug the book again.
Well, thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much for having me. My name is Robin Bernstein. My book is called Freeman's Challenge, the Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit. And you can find me online. You can find me on Instagram. You can find me on Twitter. And you can find Freeman's Challenge anywhere books are sold. You can find it at an online bookstore. You can find it at your local bookstore. And if they don't have it in stock, you can ask them to order it.